Well, good morning, and thanks for turning out at 8 a.m. after a really full and fascinating day yesterday. I appreciate you showing up. It's a real honor to be here and to be among such great thinkers who are so committed to the West, and particularly enjoyable and fun to be part of advancing the compelling vision that Wallace Stegner laid out for the West as part of his amazing contributions to American literature. We're lucky to have had such a great talent who cared so much about our region. And it's a daunting task, really, to stand up here and talk about sustainability. It's daunting because it's such a large topic, and because the West is so expansive and so variable. But it's also daunting because, in truth, I must conclude, at least to start this talk, that our region is far removed from any workable definition of sustainability. In short, our population is rapidly increasing. 8 of the 10 fastest growing cities in the country are in the West, as are our demands. Ecosystem productivity is generally low and water is scarce, and that's the good news. We've also been living beyond our means for a number of decades. Massive public works projects and federal investments have allowed the West to develop an infrastructure to support a lifestyle that really, honestly, does not currently match our scenery, which is expansive, heterogeneous, and highly variable with respect to climate. Yet, after 2 centuries of impressive efforts to bend Western landscapes to meet the expectations imported with European settlers, we're taking steps to incorporate increasing ecological understanding and cultural awareness into reducing our footprint and shifting from a mindset grounded in extraction to one focused on community and sustainability. My invitation to this conference asked me to, let's see, what am I doing wrong here? I may need some help. Okay. My invitation asked me to lead off day 2 with a perspective grounded in the West, but touching on the topics that we covered yesterday. And that's a big task, and one that I can really only do by quickly taking stock of where we stand, and then offering a few examples that I hope will tie together the themes that were shared with us yesterday. For those of you who weren't here on Thursday evening, it's helpful to know that Joseph Sachs began the symposium discussing how our concept of private property and land ownership had made it difficult for us to protect the fundamental natural services that flow from healthy ecosystems, services like fresh water and soil fertility. And this is particularly evident in the West and perhaps most strikingly obvious with respect to water. One moment here. I found it particularly interesting that he noted that our legal system, rather than protecting those services, had been evolving and changing over time to protect some increasingly unworkable conceptions of private property, the privacy, autonomy, and exclusive access that it provides. And those are obstacles to sustainability in the West that aren't going to be easily changed. 2 other general observations from yesterday. First, that meeting human needs while protecting the West's human life support system will require a lot of very ambitious changes, and that we really can't afford to wait any longer. We better get started. And secondly, I think there was a broad sense that a lot of us aren't particularly thrilled with the progress that we've made in our own disciplines in recent decades. We heard from ecologists, economists, lawyers, policy analysts, and they offered similar assessments. And we did get, luckily, a uplifting dose of optimism from Daniel Kahneman yesterday with respect to alternative energy. And I appreciate that. Thank you, because without that, it might be hard to imagine a path out of our current predicament. Water and power are good yardsticks for how we're able to conserve or move towards sustainability in the West. And my conclusion is that we are currently far outside the envelope of sustainability because we've expanded the human enterprise to levels that not only will be difficult to sustain, but that can undermine the productive capacity of the West. Just trace the flow of electricity generated from strip mine coal to massive pumps that lift water out of our highly regulated rivers so that it can flow in open canals for hundreds of miles across the desert to the country's fastest growing cities. It's a powerful force out there, and one that's flowing in opposition, or seemingly so, in opposition to this concept of sustainability. Gaylord Nelson, Herman Daly, and others pointed out decades ago that the economy is a wholly owned subsidiary of nature. We depend on ecosystems. But it's not the view that we take into the practical and rough and tumble world of managing our society. We often think of the range of possibilities, our actions, initiatives, investments, including those that will move us towards sustainability, as being circumscribed by economic conditions. And that's a practical, understandable, viable way to operate in our current society, but it's backward. If we allow economic considerations to limit our ambition with respect to sustainability, we're likely to fail. And instead, as my friend and colleague Tim Cruz reminds me, sustainability insists that instead of asking what ecological objectives are economically viable, we have to begin asking what economic objectives are ecologically viable, given the realities of the arid West. It's a profound shift. The cities that surround the Colorado Plateau, the portion of the West that I'm most familiar with, Phoenix, Las Vegas, Salt Lake, Denver, and Albuquerque, are among the fastest growing. These and others more distant still extract water and energy in vast quantities to fuel this unbridled growth that's characterized the last 50 years. And in this turbocharged race towards affluence and increasing population, we're rolling over nature, sucking the rivers dry, pumping our aquifers, stripping coal from the soil, and putting a lot of carbon into the air. And we're experimenting with climate, a climate that's already in the background highly variable and about which we don't really know very much. So we're putting at risk also a tremendous amount of cultural diversity. In this area alone on the Colorado Plateau, it's roughly the size of Germany. 1/2 of all the native language speakers in North America reside. We're also putting biodiversity at increasing risk. And providing space for biodiversity is a mighty task, and not because collectively we don't really know what to do, but because our very consumptive civilization is moving in directions that fragment habitats and toxify the environment, increase the spread of undesirable non-native species, and other things that put species like wolves, condors, and the many small things that run the planet at increasing risk. And so I wanted to kind of wrap up this taking stock stage by saying, how did this all happen? How did we manage to build a Western society that is decoupled from the way the native ecosystems work? 2 words, fossil fuels. We're sitting on an amazing fossil fuel bonanza, piled up over millennia, and used to mobilize materials, especially water, generate wealth and ratchet up productivity, and to support a social model that, if we can't redesign it before that bonanza is over, as the greater society moves on, is likely to collapse under its own ill-distributed weight. And I remember talking to Wendell Berry a decade ago when he'd visited Flagstaff, and he'd flown in and changed planes in Phoenix. And he described flying in the evening when the sun angle was low and seeing the reflections, these mirror reflections off the thousands of swimming pools in the middle of the desert as you're coming into the airport. And for him, it was a very striking thing, I think, being in that situation and then driving up to Flagstaff. And he described Phoenix, this great city in the desert, as hanging by a thread. And that thread is what has seemed to be this endless flow of fossil fuels. Gary Nabhan bravely wrote in the Arizona Republic, my home state's newspaper of record, that if civic leaders still have their heads in the sand, the rest of us must be willing to ask the obvious question: isn't it time to rationally plan the dismantling of Metro Phoenix? Which you can imagine raised a few eyebrows and generated some barbed replies from our elected leaders. But he went on to say that it's not some misanthropic death wish for urbanites. Instead, that he hoped that the best aspects of urban living could be maintained in better designed villages and carefully restored neighborhoods, a vision that I think is one that's compelling and inspiring and inviting. And so I wanted to introduce a topic that really is peripheral from my own research and work as an ecologist, but it's eking into a lot of the things I do in trying to apply that ecological understanding to the West. And it's this idea about building social capital and trying to explicitly integrate the natural and social sciences in a way that will allow us to take the second part, and maybe eventually the first part of Nabhan's vision, seriously, to benefit people and to sustain those human life support systems. So we're not really talking about rewinding the clock or some romantic vision or some draconian social order here. We're talking about a redevelopment of community organized around the recognition of the dynamics of Western landscapes and how ecosystems work. And the question, I think, is where can we go to learn about that in a place that is characterized by, indifferently, I guess, than the power centers of the continent. And so I wanted to suggest that we can turn our attention to agriculture for a bit. And on the Hopi mesas, people have been growing corn for millennia. And if you've not walked through a Hopi cornfield, you're really missing out on something very profound. It's perhaps as sustainable a crop as you could find in the arid West. And farmers start preparing to plant in February because it is a serious business to stake your family, your community, your life on a corn crop grown in one of the continent's driest places. And so there is a attention to social capital that has allowed that pattern to persist despite this great heterogeneity and highly variable climate for millennia. And these seeds are highly evolved. It's a high agricultural technology that's produced this very lean, sustainable system. And I don't mean to romanticize, and I don't mean to say that we could use that as a model ecologically, but I think there is a social model there that can give us some insight regarding the seriousness with which we need to take our investment in Western societies in order to protect Western landscapes and move towards sustainability. The practices have not changed that much. And if you go out there in a month or two, you will see people irrigating individual corn plants, getting them through this dry period in the growing season until the summer monsoon rains kick in. And if you go toward the end of that season, assuming we get some monsoons this year, it's amazing the biomass that's produced. Now, of course, it's a tiny fraction in terms of the caloric intake of the Hopi tribe, but it holds together that social cohesion and sustains that social capital, which they, and probably ourselves, will be turning to increasingly in the future. Contrast that with the industrial agriculture that has been encouraged on native lands in recent decades, and the sustainability differences come out in stark relief. I wanted to turn attention to another agricultural example of sustainability that I think can help shape our thinking, if not provide direct instruction. And that's livestock grazing, the most pervasive human land use in the West and one of the most controversial. Polarized debates over the sustainability of grazing are decades old, but more and more science, better understanding, respectful deliberations are forging collaborative approaches all across the West. Someone was estimating that there were thousands of collaborative groups that have formed around grazing and rangeland management in the last 15 years. And they're bringing old adversaries together to try and design new approaches that are sustainable. One leading example near my home is the Diablo Trust. Two ranchers and their environmental opponents came together about 13 or 14 years ago. It formed a nonprofit. A lot of public leaders and concerned citizens and others joined, and they collectively oversee over 400,000 acres of mixed public and private lands. And by fostering this collaboration, they've shown that contentious debates can lead to agreements and partnerships and on-the-ground projects that, from a very grassroots, local level, start instigating that change towards sustainability. And research has been critical to that group's long-term vision, and they have bought into investing in science, which is pretty interesting for a community group that grew out of the ranching community. And you can see in the landscape view there some of our plots, which the ranch owners will move their cattle in accordance with our experimental design. And they've been doing that for 10 years now. And it's a modest, but I think compelling model for how science and learning can transform attitudes and move towards adjustments in the way we interact with the landscape. I'm not going to go into research results in any direct way, but I will say that this investment has shown that grazing has a modest impact, I would say acceptable impact most of the time in most places, but it's the combination of, or the interaction of climate and grazing that in certain rare circumstances can put that system at a threshold where continued impact, continued disturbance can push it over into a degraded state from which is very difficult to return. And that involves facilitating the establishment and spread of non-native species, which then can preempt the native bunch grasses. And that's led this research and others around the West to the development of grazing, or of grass banks, where certain lands are withheld from grazing, managed for conservation values for the vast majority of the time. But when those certain circumstances obtain, where climatic conditions and the presence of animals put the system at risk, they can be moved into those grass banks and relieve pressure elsewhere. So that's one adaptive approach that is starting to move this decades-old controversial land use towards something that unites community and uses our increasing knowledge to try and forge a change that's acceptable and that is, rather than fracturing community, is strengthening it. So I wanted to pick up another thread on that theme and go into it in just a little bit more detail. And it involves this idea of building public science. And several people yesterday talked about expert opinion, about some inherent structural issues with the way we set up experts in our society and the difficulties of establishing the networked relationships that are important for expert knowledge to actually be utilized. And so these are some ideas that I've been developing with my colleagues as we try to move ecological science and research into the management of Western landscapes. And the basic idea here is that science, rather than dictating policy, is stronger and more useful if it empowers deliberative approaches that inform decision-making. And in the West, where there's tremendous cultural resistance to top-down management, to government, to authority in general, I think that this offers us a much more constructive way forward, not to the exclusion of traditional science-based approaches or regulatory approaches. I think all of that is very important, but without something that is growing from the community outward, I think that the cultural tendency towards resistance and conflict is going to keep us from taking actions that are going to lead to the sorts of big changes, many big changes, many big rapid changes that I think we are coming to an agreement are absolutely necessary. So I'm going to move through a few slides that are describing as best I can in a short amount of time a fairly complex initiative that we call the Forest Era Project, Forest Ecosystem Restoration Assessment or Analysis. And the basic point here that I think you're probably all familiar with is that ponderosa pine forests and a few other forest types in the West are really at risk now due to a century of fire suppression and heavy livestock grazing and other forces, logging of old trees, that have led to a forest that's very prone to uncharacteristic fire, crown fires, that can be a stand-replacing disturbance in a system that evolved with very frequent low-intensity ground fires. And so that's why we've seen these massive burns in the last 5 years that are completely unprecedented in the tree ring record and even longer paleo record. And so the question is, how can you take a diverse society with a lot of inherent disagreement or lack of mutual appreciation, et cetera, and create a vision for landscape scale intervention in an ecosystem? And it's the sort of thing that I think the U.S. Forest Service and other agencies have been grappling with for a long time, and our system is set up that almost any constituency can block an action. And so therefore it takes all constituencies supporting an action for there to be real results on the ground. And so what we've tried to do is take that model in the previous slide and employ it to this in this instance to try and inform and elevate that discussion so that a collective, a deliberative process can lead to a proposed path forward that is less likely to meet that sort of resistance that has stymied us for so long. The example application I'm going to show you is from north central New Mexico, and Santa Fe is down here near the bottom. And the Santa Fe watershed, of course, is a particularly at-risk place that people are very concerned about, but that situation where municipal watersheds are at elevated risk due to these forest conditions is widespread across the region. And so the study area is very large, a couple million acres. It extends up to the New Mexico-Colorado line. And this, too, is a very culturally diverse place. I know most of you know it well, and many of you probably know the history well enough to know that there's not a whole lot of love lost between the descendants from the recipients of the original Spanish land grants and the federal government, which expropriated communal lands that were viewed as property of these land grant communities, and has led to some significant impasse, conflict in the past, and very difficult situations. There's also a very active presence of the Pueblo tribes along the Rio Grande, the Pueblo communities, and so it's a diverse group. What we did was we first went and convened meetings with people and tried to identify what are the needs, what are the information needs. And to do that, you really need to understand the situation, appreciate the conflicts that exist, and say, well, where can information help people get over those hurdles? All right, so instead of going and just reeling in all the data and coming in with a report or set of recommendations, the effort was to first say, well, what do the people who are living here what would they find most helpful? And then to go and try to the best of our ability to develop that. And we do this with using remote sensing and developing spatial models that reflect conditions across very large areas and allow people to integrate consideration of their values and then a medium or a means to discuss that, to deliberate, negotiate if necessary, and to try and find that zone of agreement where people collectively can get behind that path forward. So the area, as I alluded to before, has a very mixed ownership pattern. I don't really need to explain that except to say that like much of the West, the property owned privately, fee simple, is a small proportion of the landscape. Tribal lands, Forest Service lands, BLM lands are prominent, and so this is an interjurisdictional problem that can't really be solved by one agency or landowner. I'm just going to show you a few examples of the data that we provide without really talking about it. There's more detail on the slide than you want, and I can give you even more if you'd like afterward. But we utilize a lot of powerful techniques to generate these spatial representations, maps, if you will, of key variables. And so we talk about the foundational data layers being those that feed into spatial models that actually depict the values that people care most about. So they don't necessarily care about canopy cover per se, but that's a component in a model that allows us to predict fire behavior, and in this case, fire risk, the probability of ignition of a large fire based on historic fires. And that then becomes a reference point to elevate that level of discourse. Similarly, biological diversity is important because people care about it, and also because there's a more stringent regulatory environment due to the Endangered Species Act and other laws. This is depicting Mexican spotted owl habitat across this entire region. You know, how many years ago? Probably about 15 years ago, this one issue brought everything to a complete standstill with respect to forest management in northern New Mexico, led to great hostility between the residents of the small villages in northern New Mexico and the environmental community, which basically used the owl to leverage the Forest Service, which responded by shutting down all harvesting, including fuelwood harvesting, that the people in these smaller villages depended on for a lot of things, including heating their homes in the winter. So these aren't theoretical or even necessarily very subtle issues. They're right in the forefront of everybody's mind. And so if you can imagine this with many more layers and possibilities, and then if you can imagine a group of people supporting a deliberative process as opposed to presenting an analysis. That's what we tried to do, and we had a series of workshops that culminated in a several-day event in Taos, where representatives who'd worked with us for over a year to get to this place came together. And these are the sorts of things that they produced by using that information in their own way to generate products that they could collectively push with the federal land and state land managers to move us in a direction of ecological restoration. This is showing priority areas based on the values represented in that diverse community, where are the places we should go first in terms of moving toward this restoration initiative. The color coding here just representing the relative priority. And this map shows what the recommended actions, actions might be taken in those priority areas, and they range from doing nothing to low intensity prescribed fire to some combination of thinning followed by fire, et cetera, as debated within the group and then translated into spatial formatting. And one of the things that's interesting, and I won't get into the process in any great detail, but one of the valuable products then also is because of the diversity of interests, we can see how much concordance there is with respect to these recommended actions. And so this one on the right, I know you don't have time to really inspect this in any detail, but shows the level of agreement within the group. And so areas that are in red there, there's still considerable disagreement about what needs to happen in those areas. But if you look to the green and blue areas, those are areas where there's very little controversy, and I think you can figure out that that's the vast majority of the landscape. And when you see that, you start asking the question, well, why are we still debating the red areas? Let's get started in the blue and green areas and move forward. That experience, that technique is in its experimental phase, not in the natural science experimental phase, but more in the social science experimental phase. And we've worked in several states, and things are moving slowly, but moving forward. And the Forest Service in the last year has developed a landscape approach, and there is a 2.4 million acre area in Arizona that there have been 3 meetings on this project while I've just been here at the symposium. So things are moving pretty quickly. The last thing I wanted to talk about was sort of is the need to target this interface between science and policy. And I wanted to put up sort of a plug, but use it more as an example of some work that I was involved in trying to deliver some recommendations to the transition team that were developed prior to the election, the last presidential election, and would have gone forward regardless of who won, to try and point out the need to focus on the western part of the country. I mean, it's a little easier now as we've gained political clout. People care about the West, but in general, it's interesting how little Western issues are debated and discussed in Washington, D.C. And so I think we all collectively need to think about how can we deliver those messages to decision makers in a framework that is practical, that they can use, and that they can act on. And that's what we attempted to do, taking this landscape scale look and saying, what are the things during a transition period that could really unlock new possibilities in moving towards sustainability? And we, as a group, this was based at Northern Arizona University where I work, but involved people from across the West, and we were able to bring in a series of speakers to give a talk, to the public, but then to work for a solid day each time with a group of graduate students and others to try and hone in on what are those key things about which we're confident, about which we think action could be taken rapidly, and to put those into a succinct format, which I'm even abbreviated further here. The issues were water and forest issues. So I'll just let you kind of breeze through those, and if you want to study this and more, there's a website. I've got a few copies of the document left over if anyone wants one. These are steps to take in forest management that could be done in the first 6 months or first year of an administration, and it's somewhat, I'm somewhat optimistic in that some of these are moving forward, perhaps not due to this effort, but maybe we had some small role in advancing it. And the third issue was tribal relations. This is one that people were more surprised, I guess, to see, but it ties back to that issue of social capital. If you look at lands owned and managed by tribal governments, it's really impressive not only how much land that is in the West, but how integral it is to any cohesive strategy for conservation. And so there are many reasons to put this near the top of the agenda in terms of the reintegration. I think there were several talks yesterday that suggested that sort of cultural recognition and respect and folding different perspectives into a unified view that everybody can advance is really the only way. And tribes have increasingly led the way on certain issues in landscape management because, in part, they can do what they want, and they've built tremendous capacity just in the last decade on these issues. And also because they have a very powerful political force. And so we can't move towards sustainability without a greater sense of inclusion. And in the West, working with and taking the lead from tribes is a huge part of our future. So I wanted to close with sort of another gut check and say, well, okay, but didn't John Wesley Powell know all this stuff a long time ago? I mean, he did. And Wallace Stegner, I think, pointed out to many of us what we might not have discovered, at least not for a long time on our own, which is that in the late 1800s, he hit on some of the key themes that have been restated and redelivered in many forms, including the one I just showed you. I mean, he talked about how to manage irrigation systems before there were very many in the arid West. He advocated for drawing water right boundaries, land ownership boundaries, and even state boundaries to reflect biogeographic boundaries, watershed boundaries, or others that made sense on the land instead of the rectilinear township and range and section system that we ultimately got. He was, very knowledgeable about many native cultures, spent a lot of time and argued for their autonomy. And for other lands, he was a strong voice for conservation, and where possible, those other lands he advocated for very low stocking rates and grazing. So he not only spent a lot of time in the West, wrote a lot about the West, he went back to Washington and joined the bureaucracy and pushed as hard as he could, and he was largely ignored. Not by history, but at the time, I would have, I'm not sure. I was going to say I would have liked to have talked to him late in his life to review that, but he saw a lot of change. A lot of it wasn't the sort of change he was advocating for, yet history has really borne him out. And so I think it's incumbent on us to say, well, why is it going to be different now? And I think there are a few reasons to be hopeful. One is that I think we do know more. We understand the complexities of Western ecosystems better than we ever did before. We also have more people, which is kind of a two-edged sword in the sense that I started out by talking about how this rapid expansion of Western cities is putting us further and further out on the edge with respect to sustainability. But it also means that there is a larger constituency. There's a greater recognition of what we have and what we stand to lose. And I think there's a much greater sense that we have to work together, that we're moving away from this individualistic, extraction-oriented, temporary Westerner kind of mentality to thinking about ourselves living in permanent communities, the way the Hopi and many others have for a long time. We're maybe not too far along in knowing how to build those societies, but I think we are convinced that we need to, and invest in this effort to build a social capital that will be with us throughout the full stretch. I think that empowering people to participate meaningfully in defining actions as opposed to opposing actions is a relatively recent change and a very encouraging one. And I think that all of us are here in this room in a much more interdisciplinary perspective than I think we would have found 20 years ago. We do want to work together. The diversity of expertise in this room is unbelievable. And I think just the fact that we're assembled and that other people are assembling in like places for similar purposes with the idea that we're going to integrate and even more is encouraging. So those are my best shot at how we can seed sustainability. And we are going to have to nurture it early on, the way those corn farmers carry water out and pour it in the old coffee cans to nurture every one of those little corn seedlings through those months of dry weather until the monsoons kick in. but at least there's some seeds out there, they're sprouting, and we have plenty of work to do. So thank you very much.